I am Thomas, a fisherman who has weathered nearly 20 years along Cornwall's jagged coast, mending boats while the sea sang its endless song. My wife Eleanor once painted dreams on canvas, but lately she only painted me as her prison. One night, with the wind howling like a banshee, she stood tall and declared she craved freedom, her voice sharp with Vivian's venom, that thrice-divorced artist who peddled liberation like cheap gin. I nodded, calm as the tide before a wreck, and said yes. She grinned, certain I would drown in her wake. She misjudged me. I filed for divorce before her smugness could settle, sold a boat, and traded the cash for a motorbike that snarled like a beast unchained. While she floundered in pretentious art fairs, I roared along cliffs with Rose, a baker whose wit cut deeper than her knives. Eleanor's real shock came when she learned I gave half my haul to the sea rescue crew, a secret she stumbled on too late. She begged me back, voice cracking, but I was already riding north, my final letter from Loch Ness hiding a truth that would gut her. Curious how a quiet man rewrote the storm. Sit close, listen well, this tale bites harder than the wind. That night, the wind howled through the cracks like a warning, carrying the icy breath of the Cornish sea into our small cottage. I sat in the workshop next door, hands stained with fish oil, the old oil lamp on the scarred wooden table casting jittery light across the walls. Outside, waves crashed against the cliffs, roaring as if to swallow the darkness, and I felt a vague unease, like the sea was whispering something I couldn't yet grasp. I'd just sharpened an old knife, its steel glinting under the lamp, when the door swung open. Eleanor stepped in, her shadow spilling long across the damp floor, hair tangled in the wind, her eyes ablaze with a fire I thought had died years ago. She stood there, saying nothing, just staring at me with a mix of pride and defiance. I set the knife down, looked up, and waited. "I want a divorce, Thomas," she said, her voice cold and sharp as the blade I'd just honed. "I need freedom. I can't stand this stifling life any longer." I watched her, letting freedom roll through my mind like a slow, powerful wave. I knew at once who'd fanned this flame in her. Vivian, her artist friend with 3 husbands left in her wake, who swept in like a small storm, trailing heavy perfume and grand tales of an unbound life. I'd heard Eleanor echo Vivian's words before, her voice thick with awe, as if divorce were a golden ticket out of this fishing village she now called a dungeon. She thought I didn't notice, but I saw it all, how her gaze at the sea had shifted from dreaming to yearning for another door. "Vivian says I'm burying myself," she went on, stepping closer, her hand slamming the table hard enough to make the lamp tremble. "She says I deserve to live, not just fade away here. I need a way out, Thomas." I stayed silent, letting her words shatter into the space like pieces of a wrecked boat. She stood there, shoulders squared, eyes gleaming with the confidence Vivian had stuffed into her, certain I'd thrash about, yell, or kneel to beg her to stay. But I didn't. I looked deep into her eyes, saw the arrogance she wore like a prize, and thought to myself she didn't know she'd just freed a shark from the net. I stood, wiped my hands on my worn jacket, and replied, "If that's what you want," I said, my voice calm as the steady lap of waves. She frowned, surprise mixing with irritation. "That's all?" she asked, her tone rising as if I'd insulted her. "You've got nothing to say? No questions why?" I shrugged, stepping past her toward the door, the cold air rushing into my chest like fresh life. "You've decided. My words won't shift that." Eleanor froze, her shadow quivering in the faint light. I heard her mutter something, maybe, "You really feel nothing," but I didn't turn to check. She pictured me breaking, clinging to her like a lost fisherman gripping wreckage. She was dead wrong. As I stepped outside, the wind stung my face, thick with salt and the sea's roar, and something stirred inside me. Not pain, not loss, but a cold spark. Opportunity. She wanted off this boat, but she didn't know I'd been ready to let go for ages. That night, I sat by the fire, watching flames lick the dry logs, their red glow painting my face. Eleanor had gone to bed, likely dreaming of the new canvases Vivian promised, a life without me. But I didn't sleep. I thought about her words, the dungeon she pinned on me, and I smirked in the dark. She saw me as the wall trapping her, a useless man who only patched boats and endured. She never guessed I had my own knife, and I'd use it to cut the rope before she could blink. She wanted freedom? Fine. I'd open the door, and she'd be stunned to see me walk through it first. The morning after, I woke early, the Cornish sky still a brooding gray, the waves crashing below like the steady breath of some slumbering giant. Sleep had barely touched me, but not from grief or regret. The fire had died in the hearth, leaving cold ash, and a sharp clarity settled in my mind like frost on the cliffs. Eleanor wanted freedom, she'd said as much, and I'd decided I'd claim it too, only on my terms. I pulled on my weathered jacket, tugged an old wool cap over my head, and pedaled my creaking bike down to Penzance, where a cramped lawyer's office hid behind a cobbled street. The old man behind the desk, his nose red from too much whiskey, squinted at me with bleary eyes as I told him I wanted to file for divorce. I wrote it plain. The boat was mine, the scrap of land too, and I'd ask nothing from her. He nodded, scratched some notes, and muttered that the papers would reach Eleanor in a few days. I thanked him, stepped outside, and drew a long breath of salty air, feeling a weight lift I hadn't known I'd carried. Days later, the postman's van grumbled to a stop outside the cottage. Eleanor opened the door, took the envelope, and I sat in the workshop, pretending to fuss with a tangle of netting. She stormed in, papers clutched in her hand, her face pale as the foam after a wave retreats. I looked up, catching the wild flicker in her eyes, not anger so much as bewilderment. "What's this, Thomas?" she asked, her voice trembling as if I'd plunged a knife into her grand design. "You filed before me? What is this?" I shrugged, threading the rope through the net, my tone even as the tide. "You wanted a divorce. I just sped things up." "Sped things up?" she echoed, stepping closer, her fingers crumpling the edges of the page. "You don't get to do this. I said it first. I'm the one who decides." I paused, met her gaze, and let a faint smile curl my lips. "Deciding isn't about who speaks first, Eleanor. I'm just handing you your freedom a bit quicker." She stood there, lips pressed tight, like a fisherman who'd tossed a fish back only to feel its teeth snap at her hand. She'd thought I'd wait, that I'd let her steer this sinking ship to whatever shore she fancied. She'd misread the currents. I stood, brushed past her, and left her to stew with those papers. That same day, I sold a little skiff I'd patched up, pocketing a decent sum. I kept it quiet from Eleanor, but I spent half on an old motorbike, black as tar, its engine snarling like the sea in a gale. The rest I slipped to the village sea rescue crew, not out of nobility, but because I savored the idea of my coin saving fools from the waves, much like Eleanor was floundering in her own storm without a clue. I took to riding along the coast, the wind whipping my face, salt and liberty mingling in every gust. Eleanor stayed inside, likely on the phone with Vivian, her voice shrill through the open window. "He's acting like I'm nothing," she snapped, and I pictured Vivian's smug chuckle on the other end, assuring her I'd crawl back soon enough. I laughed aloud as I roared down the twisting road, the engine drowning out her words. She didn't grasp that I wasn't coming back, not ever. That night, I parked the bike outside, wiping road dust from its gleaming frame under the moon's pale glow. Eleanor lingered on the porch, arms crossed, staring at me like I was some stranger washed ashore. I nodded once, said nothing, and walked into the workshop. She'd craved freedom, and I'd given it to her, but I'd carved out mine too. She'd pegged me as the quiet sort, a man who'd mend nets and take whatever came. She never dreamed I'd start sketching my own map, one where she was just a fading outline. I sat down, eyeing the old knife on the table, its edge catching the lamplight. She wanted to cut ties, but I'd beaten her to the blade, and soon she'd see I wasn't the one left adrift. The days spilled open like a tide unleashed, each ride on that black motorbike etching a fresh scar across Cornwall's cliffs. The engine thundered against the wind, salt clawing at my face as the sea below churned. A restless beast I'd once tamed, but now raced past. The village tongues wagged, branding me the fisherman who'd traded hooks for horsepower, but their chatter faded under the crash of waves. I'd found a pack of riders in St. Ives, a grizzled crew who haunted a pub perched above the harbor, its windows fogged with brine. Rose stood out among them, a baker with a gaze like chipped steel and a tongue that could carve through crust or conversation. She'd buried a husband young, her sorrow long hardened into grit, and carried a spark that flickered without fanfare. We rode in tandem, words few, her shadow weaving with mine like the sea braids itself to the shore. Unplanned, unforced, yet undeniable. Eleanor, meanwhile, sank into the mire of her own making. Rumors trickled back that she'd chased Vivian's mirage to an art fair up the coast, a tawdry circus of overblown canvases and stale wine. She'd gone seeking her soul's revival, but word was she slumped there, hands shaking over a blank sheet, her prized freedom souring into a bleak fog. I spared her no tears. She'd hammered her own chains, forged them with every barbed glance she'd thrown my way, and now she clawed at a prison she'd locked herself inside. I pressed on, mapping a ride to Scotland's raw north, where the gales could flay the past clean off my bones. Rose's eyes flashed at the prospect, her curt nod a pact, and something ignited in me, a horizon I'd never traced until the old map burned. One sodden afternoon, I crouched by the dock, coaxing the bike's chain with oil-slicked fingers, the air thick with mist and the tang of kelp. Eleanor materialized through the haze, a specter at the pier's edge, her hair lashed by the wind, her coat flapping like a tattered sail. I stood, wiping my hands, and watched her stumble forward, her face a wreckage of hollow cheeks and shadowed eyes, desperation etched into every line. She halted close, voice fraying against the sea's roar. "Thomas, I was wrong," she said, each syllable snapping like twigs underfoot. "This isn't what I wanted. I hate it. Can we start again?" I gazed at her, the woman who'd once branded me her warden, now shivering in the ruin she'd sculpted. Her words trembled there, fragile as a gull's cry, and I let them hang, relishing the sour tang of their reversal in my throat. She'd craved freedom so fiercely she'd cast me adrift, only to find the sea colder than her painted dreams. I rested a hand on the bike, arms crossed, and let my voice fall, cool and unyielding as the rocks. "You chose this, Eleanor," I said, steady as the tides pull. "You wanted freedom. I took mine too. That's where we stand." Her face shattered, tears spilling like rain on shale, and she stumbled closer, voice a broken thread. "Please, Thomas, I didn't know it'd be this empty. I need you back." I tilted my head, a thin smirk curling as I stepped away, the gap between us yawning like a chasm. "You don't need me," I said, sharp and deliberate. "You need your throne. I've stepped off the dais." She reeled, hand clutching air, the weight of it crashing through her like a wave she couldn't ride. I swung onto the bike, thumbed the throttle, and the engine roared awake. Rose rolled up then, her machine growling low, her grin a glinting edge as she tipped her head at me. Eleanor stood rooted, eyes wide and wet, as we tore off, our laughter knifing through the rumble, sharp against the wind. Later, I heard she'd found the notice board in the village square, a crumpled thank you from the sea rescue crew for my quiet gift of coin. It must have seared her, that unspoken proof I'd shed what she thought I'd clutch, a blade she'd handed me, turned back on her own illusions. That night, I sat by the workshop fire, its warmth seeping into my palms, the old knife on the table gleaming like a silent vow. Eleanor had tried to claw back the frame she'd smashed, but I'd redrawn mine beyond her reach. She'd seen me ride away with Rose, felt the life pulsing in our wake, and realized too late I'd slipped her grasp for good. I thought of Scotland's brutal skyline, the road unrolling north, and grinned into the dark. She'd wanted to sever the line, but I'd sliced it clean, and now she'd drown in the undertow of her own tide. The road to Scotland unfurled like a ribbon of shadow, fierce and untamed, the black motorbike thrumming beneath me as the wind clawed at my weathered jacket. Rose rode beside me, her machine a dark echo, her form slicing through the mist that clung to the highland's jagged spine. We'd shed Cornwall weeks back, swapping its salt-drenched cliffs for these brooding peaks and moors, stained with peat and silence. The air here cut deeper, laced with the bite of pine and the wet scent of ancient stone, each mile peeling away the husk of a life I'd left to rot. I'd sent postcards to the sea rescue kids in the village, rough notes about glens and lochs scratched onto flimsy stock, my pen pressing hard as if to mark my claim. They'd tacked them up, I was told, a scrappy testament to my flight, and I savored that. Those boys dreaming of waves while I conquered the earth. Rose and I spoke little, our bond woven in the quiet between engine growls. She'd point to a storm-etched ridge or flash a grin when rain stung us slantwise, her steady fire a tether in this boundless wild. We'd pause at wind-battered bothies or smoky pubs, trading tales over chipped mugs, hers of yeast and hearths, mine of tides and tangles. Her laugh sparked like flint on steel, and I felt the old weight slough off, a skin I'd outgrown, leaving me raw and alive, a man riding north with no strings to pull me back. Scotland became our crucible, its low skies and defiant land daring us to press on, and we answered, etching our marks into its stillness. Whispers of Eleanor drifted up through a scrawled letter from a village mate, thin as the paper it came on. She'd holed up in a dank flat above the fishmongers, the stench of cod seeping into her walls, her dreams now dust on a shelf beside that framed sketch of us. Vivian's voice had faded, her gilded promises washed out like cheap ink, and Eleanor sat alone, nights bleeding into silence. She'd craved freedom, they said, but it arrived as a hollow husk, a trap she'd sprung on herself when she shoved me out. I didn't crow over it. She'd cast her lot and watched it sink, while I'd hauled in the catch, clean and simple. One dusk, we camped by Loch Ness, the water a glassy void under a sky bruised purple, the bike's engine ticking cool beside a crackling fire. I fished a postcard from my pack, scratched out a line about the beast that never surfaced, and penned it to Eleanor. Rose cocked an eyebrow as I slid it into my pocket, her smirk glinting but silent. The next morning, I posted it from a rusted box in a crooked hamlet, the image catching the bike against the loch's sheen, my words curt. Found my current, hope you ride yours. It wasn't venom, though it'd sting like salt in a cut. It was a seal, a line drawn under a chapter I'd closed, and I knew it'd land like a stone through her fragile glass. That night, I stood on a bluff above the loch, the wind keening through the heather, Rose at my side with her coat flapping in the gusts. The fire's glow flickered in her gaze, and I pictured Eleanor in that fetid flat, staring at my card under a flickering bulb, the sketch beside her a ghost she couldn't exorcise. She'd wanted to snap the cord, to paint me out as the shadow she'd outrun. She never guessed I'd been sketching my own breakout, biding time until she tossed me the brush. Now I stood here, the highlands sprawling vast and wild, the bike a dark oath beside me, while she sat there, choking on the stillness she'd demanded. I turned to Rose, her profile etched against the flames, and murmured over the gale, "Further?" She grinned, stomping the embers to ash. "Forever," she said, and we swung onto the bikes, engines snarling into the void. The path ahead stretched fierce and free, a canvas unbound, and I didn't glance back. Eleanor had her liberty, her sketch of what might have been, but I had mine, painted in grit and wind, stretching beyond her sight. She'd feel that postcard's weight, know I'd sailed past her horizon, and wonder where her tide had gone. Our stories split there, hers fading to gray, mine burning bright, both free in ways she'd never fathomed. And so my tale winds down, or maybe it spins anew, a story of tides and reckonings forged from Cornwall's salt to Scotland's fierce wilds. Eleanor craved freedom, thought she could seize it by shoving me aside, only to find it a mirror that reflects your own grit when the waves crash hard. I claimed mine, not with shouts or venom, but with a steady snip of the cord she thought she'd wield, and it tasted sharper than she'd ever imagined. The truth? Freedom isn't snatched, it's carved, and it shows you clear when the storm strips everything else away. She glimpsed regret in her glass. I saw a road stretching boundless. What about you, listening out there? Ever chased a gust and watched it tear your map apart? Or cut the line and found your own star blazing? I'd bet some of you hold tales tougher than mine, lessons scored in dust and brine. Share them below. Tell me how you've risen or reeled. I'll return someday, when the wind summons me back. For now, steer your current, and don't glance over your shoulder unless it's worth the look.